Okay, I'm gonna bang out another 2 videos today just because I did have more topics that were asked for. One of them is just kind of touching on how to be more coachable. I'm not a big fan of these videos usually. I think they come off as really pretentious and suggesting that a lot of the errors are on the athlete's side rather than the coach's side, which often they are, but I think coaches will sometimes use that to remove blame from themselves, right? They're not communicating what needs to be done in an effective manner because there is a very distinct part of coaching is your ability to communicate, right? And that's the part I'm much weaker at. I have a reasonable understanding of programming. I've got a reasonable understanding of all of that. I'm not the strongest communicator in the world, right? So I guess I'm putting this out there both for the people I coach or for other people who have coaches or just people who train with other people who might give them cues to work on things, right? So this isn't exclusive to people with a coach. Because I think it's really important because the majority of people don't have a coach, and that's totally okay. So I would say almost really the video is addressing how to respond to cueing because I think people just misunderstand, and I think people coming from a sporting background maybe understand a little bit better based on their prior information, but people especially who haven't played very many sports might struggle with it. So first thing first, you have to realize that coaches aren't magic. They don't know exactly what cue will work for you. It's more of a trial and error. You're working alongside them to fix a technical fault, right? It's not just they're telling you what to do, you do it and it's magically fixed. I don't care how good your coach is, they might miss the ball sometimes, and that is okay. You cannot expect them to always nail it the first try. That's normal, right? So your coach might see a technical fault, right? And they might have a bag of cues that all do the same thing. Most good coaches will have a variety of cues that all mean the same thing. There's a lot of cues that have very similar results for, like, let's say spread the floor, torque your feet into the ground, focusing on what your feet are doing, knees out, open your taint. For the most part, those cues are all doing the same thing. They just different ones register with different people, and that's okay. So your coach will feed you a cue, and rather than just try it for one set, say that didn't work, miss the ball with that cue. You do need to try it for at least a couple of sessions. Really focus on that on all of your warm-ups because it's hard to focus on cues on high effort top sets, but really focusing on your warm-ups, implementing it for a few sessions before you report back to your coach and say, hey, this cue is not working, but I've tried it across multiple sessions. Because of course, if you try it one time and you're an advanced lifter, it's not going to instantly fix your issue most of the time. That doesn't mean it's a bad cue, it just means you need more practice implementing it. Another reason is because you need to implement the cue on light work because that's what's going to fix the error. Sometimes, let's just say, I'm going to oversimplify something, right? So your knees knock in on your squat. You could say that's a motor pattern issue. You could say blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, probably you benefit from your abductors being a bit stronger, right? Well, the best way to get your abductors stronger relative to a squat is to do more squats without your knees knocking in, right? So you need to cue knees out or spread the floor on a bunch of lighter squats and keep your knees out, and your max with your knees staying out will progress, but you have to implement that cue for probably a whole block before that really shows up all the way at maximal weights, right? Of course, that first session, if I just cram my knees out on my top set and I haven't built that strength of driving my knees out by cueing that for an extended period of time, it's not going to fix it right away, and that's okay. You just have to realize that you have to stick with a cue before you say it's ineffective. But don't stick with it for like comically long time. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. If it doesn't make sense to you, ask your coach if they've got any other good ways to think of it. And if your coach doesn't, that doesn't mean they're a bad coach. They just haven't come across someone who doesn't register it, or they don't have the cue. That's okay. That's where you can ask other people, right? Other lifters you respect, especially if you have a reasonable coach. Some people are real control freaks and they're like, don't tell my athletes what to do. If you're coached by me and a guy at your gym who's better than you tells you to try something, you try it and it works, do it. I don't give a shit if it came from me or not. What I care about is your results, right? So the source of that information doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is the result. But you can report back to them, or you can look around and find cues that are addressing the same deficiency and implement those for a while. And eventually you'll find this is the cue that works for me, right? So it's the same thing. If someone at your gym bounces something off to you, and you say, hey, that kind of makes sense. Try it for a while. Maybe run it by your coach. Maybe there's a chance it's doing something different than what you think it is, and it might not be actually what you're supposed to be working on, right? But the biggest thing is to view it as a process. It is trial and error. It's not just your coach feeding you fixes, right? And the second you start thinking about that as you're working alongside your coach, and every cue is an ongoing process, the much better your results are going to be.